I upload daily NBA videos on this channel, so if that is something that interests you, then subscribe. Also drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. Also real quick, my second most recent video, my video on LeBron James and his 2007 finals run, unfortunately is not doing as well as it should because I had to upload my initial reactions to the James Harden trade. So if you could go watch that video if you have not already, I would really appreciate it because that's one of the best videos that I have made in months. And I just unfortunately kind of had to stunt it because of the Harden situation. But speaking of the Harden situation, today while everyone's talking about what it means for the Nets and what it means for the Rockets and the Pacers and the Cavs, although those last two teams, no one really cares about them right now. Also, the Cavs got a steal, so it's not like anyone's really freaking out. What I want to talk about today is the Philadelphia 76ers and if they made a mistake by not trading for James Harden. So what's first important to mention is what the trade package kind of was supposed to be, because we're never really going to know the exact details, but it was pretty much implied that the Rockets were asking for Ben Simmons, Tyrese Maxey, Matisse Thybulle, and 3 first-round picks. The Philadelphia 76ers said no to this. They said that's a little bit too much for my liking. We're going to pass on this trade. And then the Rockets obviously went with that Nets trade. There could be an argument to be made that maybe that trade package was actually on the table for the Rockets and they just saw 4 first-round picks, 4 swaps, and Victor Oladipo and was like, we'd rather have this, which I wouldn't really think, but I guess that's what they were thinking. If that's the case, then the Sixers just put their best offer available and then the Rockets passed on it, then it is what it is. But it seems to be implied that the Sixers were being a little bit stingy with their assets. So I initially said, when this trade was being reported, the amount that seemed like the Sixers were going to have to give up was gradually increasing. It went from Ben Simmons and a couple of first-round picks to Ben Simmons and Tyrese Maxey and a couple of first-round picks to Ben Simmons, Tyrese Maxey, Matisse Thybulle, and a couple of first-round picks. And as that gradually increased, I was like, this is getting a little bit steep. I understand that you're trading for an MVP, a superstar, a top 7 player in the NBA, but pretty much anytime you're trading for a player of any level of caliber, you're going to get a little bit less than what they're actually worth, especially if you're in a situation that the Rockets are in, where he is forcing his way out. He's on a 2-year contract, and he has stated what teams he's actually interested in going to. So his actual trade value is not as high as how actually good he is. That's how it always has worked with superstar caliber players when they ask for a trade. It's how it's always worked with star caliber players when they've asked for a trade. It's just the unfortunate circumstances surrounding the player that means you're going to get less value than the actual player themselves. So it makes sense to not be willing to give up the kitchen sink because you don't necessarily have to. And as important as it is to make sure you're not being too stingy, you also need to be sure that you're not giving away too much. So the question is, were the Sixers being too stingy, or were they making sure they were not giving away too much? So like I said, my initial reaction was that this trade was too much, but pretty much immediately after, I've said the word much way too much here, pretty much immediately after the Nets trade was announced, I was like, now that I think about it, the Sixers should have made the trade. I think they should have made that trade, even if I feel like that was a little bit too much than I would really be comfortable with if I was the Sixers. The fact of the matter is, James Harden and Joel Embiid together as a duo is fantastic. And as high as I am on Ben Simmons, which is much higher than the average NBA fan, as I came to find out because there were people saying that Brandon Ingram was better than him on Twitter the other day. As high as I am on Ben Simmons, I don't think he's a good fit next to James Harden. I believe it's in the best interest, not James Harden, Joel Embiid. Ben Simmons is not an ideal fit next to Joel Embiid, despite the fact that I think very highly of Ben Simmons. I think it's really in the best interests of both parties there that they go their separate ways. I actually think Ben Simmons would be really well utilized as a center, and that's not something that they're going to be doing much on the Sixers because Joel Embiid's there. Embiid's been shooting well from 3 this year, but regardless of that, he's never going to be a stretch guy more than a post guy. And Ben Simmons, I really just think he needs to be in a system where he's surrounded by shooting. And part of the reason that I really wanted to see this trade was because I wanted to see Ben Simmons have his own team in the Houston Rockets rather than him being the second guy to a Joel Embiid. That's obviously not going to be happening now. But as high as I am, as I said, on Ben, these two together does not have the ceiling that I think James Harden and Joel Embiid together have. And yeah, the roster would have been relatively depleted, wouldn't have had a bunch of first round picks to trade because the Stepien rule would have prevented a lot of that. So making trades for other players to fill out the roster would not have been amazing. But at the very least, your starting lineup would have been James Harden, Seth Curry, Danny Green, Tobias Harris, and Joel Embiid. And even though their bench unit would be barren, that is a pretty good starting lineup for damn sure. And I think the Sixers could have been contenders. I mean, they still would have had Shake Milton off of the bench, who's good. Furkan Korkmaz is a decent shooter who can play like 18 minutes a game. Mike Scott is an okay shooter, but in terms of playoffs, yeah, this would not have been a deep roster. I feel like there's a name that's going over my head right now on that Sixers roster that I'm going to get made fun of for missing. Oh well, but it no doubt would have been a very good team. But it's also important to consider the risks in this potential move. James Harden and Joel Embiid is not so good that it guarantees a championship. In fact, I don't think it's so good it guarantees an Eastern Conference Finals appearance, and especially not even a win. So there's an argument to be made that with Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid, you don't really have a 2-year window with those guys. You have like a 4 or 5 year window, unless you want to make the argument that Joel Embiid is just going to be an injury-riddled mess in 4 years, which I think there's a very legitimate case that could be. There's a longer time to actually make that work with those two than it would be with Harden and Embiid, because Harden's on a 2-year contract, and if things are not looking good and he's like 33, 34 years old, he might be like, yeah, I know I asked to be here, but this is not going all that well, and I would like to win a championship before my career is over, so I am out. That is the potential risk in this trade, on top of the fact that James Harden is like, I think he's like 7 years older than Ben Simmons. So it's the argument of, would you rather have another decade of Ben Simmons versus like 5 years of James Harden? I understand that argument. I think the ceiling of this team is a championship with James Harden, whereas right now, with what they're at right now, I think it's more like just short of a championship. I could see this team making an Eastern Conference Finals appearance and even putting up a good fight, but they're not. I don't think they're a championship contender legitimately. They've opened up the season very well, excluding that game where they kind of got shafted because they had to play with 8 guys while other teams have been able to avoid it. This is definitely the best the Sixers have looked since when they had Jimmy Butler on that team, and part of that is because Daryl Morey's done a good job with the team. One positive to come out of this is that the Sixers still have all of their assets outside of Ben Simmons, so if they want to make a trade for, let's say Bradley Beal becomes available because the Wizards have sucked, they could move Maxey Thybulle and those first round picks and hold on to Ben Simmons, and you can have Ben Simmons, Bradley Beal, and Joel Embiid, and there's an argument to be made that those three together is better than just James Harden and Joel Embiid. I think there's a very legitimate argument for that. It's just a matter of if that star player becomes available, whether it's a Bradley Beal or somebody else. It also has to be a guy who fits with what the Sixers do, so it can't just be anybody, but at least they do still have their assets. I think Tyrese Maxey is going to be a very valuable asset. They could just wait and watch him become the player that I think he can be, which is a very good player, or they can trade him for the value that he has. But whether or not the Sixers actually made a mistake by not trading for James Harden is really something we're going to have to wait and see. My initial reaction after the Nets made this trade was, yeah, the Sixers probably should have given that up, even though I really didn't want to see them do that. At the same time, I also did, because I was like, in my head, I was like, that's too much. But also, once I realized that trade wasn't happening, I was like, it probably wasn't too much. I was being overly dramatic. So I do believe the Sixers should have made this trade. The degree to which they will regret it is going to base entirely upon what happens over the next couple of years. If the Nets implode, it's not going to be that big of a deal for them, although that situation is not really comparable. There's a good chance James Harden and just Joel Embiid works out just fine. But also, it's not a team that's going to get in their way necessarily. On top of that, if they are able to make a trade for a Bradley Beal type, or even just a Zach LaVine type of player, and that gets them over the hump and they just kind of fill out the roster with good role players, I think there is an argument to be made that that team can be better than James Harden and Joel Embiid. But that, as I said, something we're going to have to wait and see. So, like I said, the degree to which the Sixers will regret this trade is entirely dependent on what happens in the future. We're just going to have to wait and see. But I'm pretty damn sad that I am missing the Ben Simmons owns his own team type of deal. I wanted to see that happen, honestly, more than I wanted to see James Harden on the Sixers. That was really just a byproduct of me wanting to see a team build around Ben Simmons. I don't know that the ceiling of a team built around Ben Simmons is championship contender, but it's a thing that I wanted to see just because I think it'd be fun. I know NBA teams that want to build around what I think is fun, but what they think is actually going to work. But regardless of that, I wanted to see it happen, and I'm sad that it didn't. But there's a good chance the Sixers really didn't make a big mistake. There is a good chance they made a huge mistake. We're just going to have to wait and see. Again, go check out that LeBron video. It's not only did I put a bunch of stuff into that, Rudy went the extra mile in his edits, so I feel like it's worth rewarding him as well that you go watch that video. Shout out to Rudy though for editing this video, speak of the devil, and that is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.